The playoffs are here, and you can predict the action all the way to the finals with FanDuel Predicts. Predict the spread, the total points, and even the game-winning moments that make the playoffs. Sign up and get a $25 bonus with FanDuel Predicts.
Offered by FanDuel Prediction Markets, LLC, a registered futures commission merchant. 18-plus bonus is non-withdrawable and expires 7 days after receipt. Trading derivatives involves significant risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Manage your activity with their consumer protection tools. Restrictions apply. See terms at FanDuel.com/predicts/bonus-offer-terms.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
You are now entering the Stone Zone. Well, I am the ultimate political animal. I eat, sleep, and breathe politics. A lot of people ask me how that started. When I grew up in the New York City suburbs in the small town of Lewisboro, New York, having been born in the Norwalk, Connecticut hospital and lived between New Canaan, Connecticut and Lewisboro, New York, specifically in the part of town called Vista. The woman who lived next door to us, Gladys Rockwell, was a very avid Women's Republican Club member and a real conservative. Up until about the time I was 11 years old, I wanted to be an actor. My parents correctly knew that I'd probably starve to death. They urged me to go into a trade like an electrician or a plumber or a wallboard man. Those guys made good money, my dad would say. But, well, Gladys Rockwell gave me a paperback book called Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. And once I read that book, it completely transformed my life. You see, I really could identify with what Goldwater was talking about. Small, limited government, peace through strength, a strong national defense as a deterrent against aggressive action by the United States, ardent anti-communism, low taxes, low regulations, maximum personal freedom. To me, this became an avocation. I immediately became a Goldwater zealot. I would ride my bike to the local Republican headquarters. I had my bike plastered with Goldwater bumper stickers. Of course, when you're 12 years old, you don't know too much about the realities of American politics. I did know that Lyndon Baines Johnson was a major crook based on his involvement in the Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Sol Estes scandal. And of course, I was crushed when my hero, Barry Goldwater, whose posters, festooned my bedroom, was defeated in one of the greatest landslides in American political history. At that point, I began reading more about history, and I began to focus on not the 1964 election, in which Goldwater was defeated, but on the 1960 election, in which Richard Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, had been very narrowly defeated. And I concluded, just based on my reading, that Nixon was a much better candidate than Barry Goldwater. Goldwater, as it turned out, was a fairly cranky guy who went out of his way to lose the 1964 election. You see, Barry Goldwater didn't really want to run for president. He had been drafted by the growingly dominant conservatives in the Republican Party. He went to Florida and talked about privatizing Social Security. He went to Tennessee and talked about privatizing the Tennessee Valley Authority. He even waxed poetic about the possibility of using nuclear devices to defoliate the jungles in Vietnam. That led to his being called a warmonger, trigger-happy, and, of course, the devastating defeat. Richard Nixon was more pragmatic. I think he stood for the same things as Goldwater. But I came to the conclusion that despite the fact that he had made a number of errors in the 1960 skin-tight election with John F. Kennedy, that he'd been cheated out of victory. Now, he bumped his knee on a car door. This was before Labor Day. That developed into a staph infection. Nixon, as the vice president and the Republican nominee, was actually hospitalized after Labor Day for about 10 days while he saw his opponent, the charismatic and charming and incredibly handsome John F. Kennedy, crisscrossing the country and pulling out to a small lead. Then, of course, Nixon made the mistake of pledging to visit all 50 states. That meant he got stuck going to states like Vermont and Utah, where he was going to win anyway. JFK spent his time focusing on the swing states that were under contest. And then lastly, of course, was the decision to debate. Now, Nixon, as the vice president, told his campaign manager, told Dwight Eisenhower that he would not debate the lesser known and less experienced John F. Kennedy. He told New York Governor Tom Dewey that as well. So, of course, all of them were surprised when Nixon not only agreed to debate, but agreed to a series of 4 debates. That debate, of course, would end up being fatal to Nixon's candidacy. Nixon rushed out of the hospital where he'd been laid up with a bum knee, still on antibiotics, underweight, having lost weight in the hospital. He hit 5 state rallies on his way to Chicago. Meanwhile, John F. Kennedy was sunning himself on the roof of his Chicago hotel with 2 gorgeous hookers. When Nixon and Kennedy went to the sound check for their famous first televised debate, well, they said Nixon's face was almost as gray as his suit. And then, of course, in one of the great fake-outs of all time, Don Hewitt, who was the producer of that debate, went to Senator Kennedy and said, Senator Kennedy, will you be requiring makeup? And, of course, John Kennedy said, no makeup for me. Hewitt then turned to Vice President Nixon and said, Mr. Nixon, will you be requiring makeup? Having heard Kennedy decline makeup, Nixon said, no makeup for me. Whereupon John F. Kennedy went to his dressing room where his own personal makeup man who'd been flown in from New York made him up. Nixon's advisors had realized that he had always suffered from a 5 o'clock shadow, and realizing he was both pale and underweight from his recent hospital stay, finally convinced him to use a product called Lazy Shave, which was a makeup that you applied over your beard to conceal it. Well, the Kennedy advance men had very cleverly come into the studio earlier and turned off the air conditioning because they knew that Nixon had a tendency to sweat when under pressure. To his great surprise in the debate, John F. Kennedy got to Richard Nixon's right, hitting Nixon for not doing enough as part of the Eisenhower administration to remove Fidel Castro from Cuba, claiming that there was a missile gap, and criticizing Nixon over 2 Chinese islands, Quemoy and Matsu, that were being contested by both the Communist Chinese and the Nationalist Chinese in Taiwan. Richard Nixon never expected John Kennedy to come at him from the right. He found himself on defense, or in many cases, insisting that he and Kennedy agreed to the same goals, they just had different methods. The debate was a disaster for the more experienced Vice President Richard Nixon. He began to sweat, and as he began to sweat, the Lazy Shave beard makeup began to run. It is recorded that Nixon's own mother, watching this on TV, called his private secretary, Rosemary Woods, and asked, "Is Richard unwell?" After the debate, Chicago Mayor Daley was so ebullient, he said, "Look at Nixon. He's not even dead yet, and they've already embalmed him." The debate was an unmitigated disaster. Now, it is true, by the way, that those who listened to the radio listened to the debate on the radio actually believed that Nixon had won, whereas those who watched the debate on TV overwhelmingly said that Kennedy had won. In fact, Lyndon Johnson, who was John F. Kennedy's running mate, listened to the radio, the debate on the radio, on a car radio actually, and thought that Kennedy had blown it, whereas Henry Cabot Lodge, who was Nixon's running mate for vice president and watched the debate on TV, decided that Nixon had blown it for the Republican ticket. In any event, because of all of these mistakes, I believe that Nixon made a late rally in that election. Dwight Eisenhower had a low regard for John F. Kennedy, really questioned whether he was prepared for the presidency. But unbeknownst to Nixon, Mamie Eisenhower, the First Lady, had told Pat Nixon that Dwight Eisenhower's delicate heart condition would not allow him to campaign for his own vice president, and that Nixon should not ask Ike to take to the stump. Eisenhower and Nixon were both unaware of this. Eisenhower got angrier and angrier. First of all, he didn't want John F. Kennedy to be president. Secondarily, he thought Nixon was trying to win on his own without the help of Ike. What people don't know is that Eisenhower broke out of this in the end and made extraordinarily successful campaign appearances in New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles in the closing days of the 1960 race. Nixon also, unlike the free-spending, multimillionaire father-funded John F. Kennedy, had husbanded his money for the close of the campaign, and therefore in the last 30 days he was competitive in terms of paid advertising, like early television and, of course, terrestrial radio. So I believed, and I believe today, that Nixon actually closed the gap. If you read my book, Tricky Dick, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Richard Nixon, or my book, Nixon's Secrets, The Real Story of Watergate, I make a very good case that the 1960 election was stolen. Stolen not just in Illinois, as is widely believed, but also stolen in the state of Texas. Now, Texas had a very interesting ballot. It was a paper ballot. In Texas, you circled the names of the candidates you were not for, leaving uncircled the candidate you were for. It's completely disingenuous. Unfortunately, that standard was not held in every county. The Kennedy-Johnson ticket only carried Texas by 25,000 votes over the Nixon Lodge ticket, and 95,000 Nixon Lodge ballots were discarded and burned in Dallas County alone. So I came to the conclusion as a young man that Richard Nixon had been robbed of the presidency. And I wrote him a letter at his New York law office where he was in exile, urging him to run again. Imagine my surprise several years later when John Whitaker, an assistant to former Vice President Richard Nixon, called my home, where I lived with my parents, of course, and asked whether I was still interested. Next thing you know, I was a staff member in Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign, working essentially as a gopher. That's how it all began. That's the inside story of how the Stone Zone became the hottest political radio show on radio today, and we'll be right back on the other side.